which is building a network of worker-owned co-ops in underserved communities in Springfield, Massachusetts. Welcome, Emily Kawano.
David, it's a pleasure to be here. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I am going to share my screen. So fingers crossed this all works. Okay. Are you all seeing it full screen now?
Yes.
Is that working? Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk about solidarity economy and what it is, but I'm also going to talk about system change. And so when we're talking about system change, we actually have some clarity about what kind of system change we're talking about. So let me just start by acknowledging that we are in this historic moment, once in a generation, maybe once in 2 generations, where there are these multiple convergent crises: the pandemic, the racial justice uprisings, climate change, this creeping rightward shift towards fascism. And there are other ones that we can mention, but the important point is that there's a lot of disruption going on right now. And there's a lot of questioning about the status quo. And there's a lot of questioning about the
So Emily, I am so sorry to tell you that we're having a hard time hearing you, and now we don't hear you at all. Emily, we can't hear you. Emily, we're not hearing you. So I don't know what to say. So I think what I will do, Emily, while you try to work that out, please continue. No, we're not able to hear you. So what I will say is, in a pinch, I'm going to just step in and say that either I can do this presentation or I can just talk. What I am in your hands here, Emily, but we're not able to hear you at all.
I'd say, Emily, just try to call in with your phone, if you can. If you go to the audio option and you select switch to phone audio, you'll see the number. Oh, okay. Maybe I would say, David, you go ahead and take the reins.
Folks, what I'm going to do is just do a very quick overview. The Solidarity Economy Network exists and came out of the U.S. Social Forum, which was convened in 2007 in Atlanta. And Emily and others brought a group together of folks who were working on worker co-ops, community land trust, participatory budgeting, a whole host of these policies that are, in our language, non-reformist reforms. These were ways to meet people's immediate material, tangible needs in a non-capitalist or post-capitalist manner. One thing that's important for us at the Solidarity Economy Network is to be clear that what we are both against and what we are for. We are explicitly post-capitalist. That's because we believe that capitalism actually can be well understood by anyone. And therefore, we use the basic framework of the Center for Popular Economics that talks about 5 key characteristics. The first characteristic is the private ownership of the means of production. That's pretty easy to understand, right? Private property rights uber alles, private ownership of factories, of farms, of all of the things, private ownership. The second characteristic of a capitalist economy is that goods and services are produced as commodities to be bought and paid for at a profit. That is to compare and contrast it to when you produce goods and services for human need. The third characteristic we've already prefaced, and that is profit maximization. The idea that human activity and human economic activity is always all about just trying to make as much money as you can, and you only do things in order to make a profit. The fourth characteristic of a capitalist economy is that labor itself is just one more commodity. And the fifth allocation is the concept that the market allocates all of it. And ideally, you would have no involvement of the government at all, or as little government as possible. So those 5 characteristics, by the way, y'all, that's literally how it would literally be described in virtually any introduction to economics textbook in this country. It is basically how capitalism works. Now, what we say at the Solidarity Economy Network is, if you actually take that approach, you literally are describing the ideology of the cancer cell. We are literally going to destroy the planet that we depend upon for life itself if we continue that, because we are co-modifying Earth faster than Mother Earth can replenish herself, and we are stripping away the dignity of human labor, and we are literally severing the relationship that we have between one another as human beings and the natural world. So that's what we're against. What we're for is a new economic framework. Remember, economics just comes from the Greek word that means the management of the household, right? So when people tell me that economics are too hard to understand, I scoff at them, because the reality is that's what the ruling elite have trained and taught us to think. But the reality is we absolutely are able to understand economics, and I believe we can teach one another the basic framework. So the framework for the Solidarity Economy Network is equally easy to understand. The first principle is a commitment to cooperation, and that is the notion that rather than competition and power over, we engage in cooperation and power with dynamics. The second characteristics of a solidarity economy is equity across all dimensions. Equity is not the same thing as equality. Equity is a core commitment to justice and fairness, and that means across all dimensions, means across race, across gender, across ethnicity and nationality, across different abilities. Like, we make an absolute commitment that equitable dynamics in relationship have got to be part of both the political economy. The third characteristic of a solidarity economy is participatory democracy. In a nutshell, it means this: if there is any decision that affects your life, you ought to get an opportunity to help participate in making that decision. Doesn't mean you get your way. It means that there should be a collective approach to which you are able to actually participate in making that decision. The fourth characteristic of a solidarity economy is a commitment to a regenerative, sustainable ecology. And we are leaning ever more into regeneration, not just sustaining the existing environment and ecology, but to regenerate it, to return back to an earth and a biocentric understanding that human beings are not above nature. We are literally part of it, and that we as human beings and as living beings, in fact, are part of an interconnected web of life. And whatever we do to that web, we will ultimately do to ourselves. So frankly, whether you come at that from an eco-feminist spiritual tradition, or whether you come at it from a hard scientific approach, or like me, you say they are both equally valid, the point is an understanding of regenerative, sustainable ecology and an economics that is regenerative. That's a key characteristic. And the fifth characteristic, and this is important, y'all, a commitment to pluralism. Pluralism means that there are multiple ways to get to that world that we want. We are not rigid. We are not dogmatic. We are not doctrinaire. We understand that there are many different approaches that anyone may take. One of the metaphors that Emily and I often use is there are multiple paths up the mountain. And if people are trying to get to that mountain of liberation and joy and justice and a new economic framework, Emily and I are pursuing one approach, but if folks are trying other things, we say, may the goddess bless you. Please, let's meet at the mountaintop. We don't know, right? So we have a real intellectual humility. One thing we do believe, capitalism as an economic system is destroying the planet. We need to embrace a truly post-capitalist version, but I want to conclude with this. I might be wrong. I don't think I'm wrong, but I might be wrong. So for those folks who believe that capitalism can be reformed, I say, well, let's work together while we can. And that's the spirit of pluralism, where we say many efforts and we welcome them all. So I am so sorry that you had me, a poor substitute for Emily Kawano, who is a dear friend, a mentor, and the founder of the entire U.S. Solidarity Economy Network. I did my best to try to sort of lay out what she has taught to me. And hopefully we'll work out the technical problems and she can join us during the discussion. Now I'm going to bring into the conversation Yassi Eskandari, who is an attorney and policy director at the Sustainable Economies Law Center. She led the campaign that established the groundbreaking worker cooperative development policies in the city of Berkeley, and she coordinates the statewide California Worker-Owned Recovery California Coalition, also known as WORK. She is co-chair of the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives Policy and Advocacy Council and sits on the board of the Bay Area Network of Cooperatives, beautifully named No Boss. Yassi, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you. Does everyone see my screen now?
Yes.
Wonderful. And thank you so much, David, for jumping in there. And Emily, we're so sorry we couldn't hear directly from you, and hopefully we'll get your audio set up before the Q&A. But thank you for the introduction. So again, I work at the Sustainable Economies Law Center and coordinate the Worker-Owned Recovery California Coalition, also known as WORK. And I'm happy to be here today to really talk about what this coalition is, why we formed, and also perhaps how to get engaged and in what we're doing this year. So our origin story is actually pretty cool. We really convened in 2019 around a lot of buzz around worker cooperatives. In fact, in the assembly side in particular, thanks to Ash Cholera and others, there was a lot of engagement in how worker cooperatives can be an economic development tool that is equitable, addresses our existing gender and race wealth gaps, and really can be a way for us to build a 21st century economy that addresses a lot of pre-existing harms. So we were extremely excited, we being co-op advocates and labor unions and employee ownership sort of advocates and worker owners. We came together to see, okay, what are our priorities? How can we really ride this wave of interest and figure out how to advance our agenda in a way that is also practical and feasible for that time? So we had a lot of really interesting conversations, difficult conversations, and came up with some fantastic ideas, which we started to advance in 2020. But as with most things that were happening in 2020, when the pandemic hit, all of those plans fell by the wayside. But, you know, when the pandemic hit, I emailed this same group of people and said, what are we going to do? What are we going to do now? And because really, I have this confidence that worker ownership is a solution to problems that we had before the pandemic, and also problems that have really been highlighted and have come to a head due to the pandemic. So that led to forming Worker-Owned Recovery California, which was very tailored to pandemic recovery, economic recovery. And thankfully, all the work we had done before, and much of it led into being ready to hit the ground running. Really, why cooperatives in terms of how is that addressing the problems at hand? Well, first of all, we're solving for two crises that existed before COVID and then also COVID itself. The silver tsunami, which is basically the majority of privately held businesses in the US that have employees, are are owned by baby boomers, and baby boomers have entered retirement age, which has been dubbed the silver tsunami, because as they entered retirement age, they needed a succession plan. Most of them didn't, and most of them still do not. And really that serves as a huge threat to small businesses and also jobs. So really, who is going to be anchoring essential services and goods in our communities, and also what's going to happen to all of those jobs? This would also, the racial wealth gap, as I'm sure folks who are tuning in today know, has been and still is a huge problem for us, as well as, like I said, the COVID pandemic. So really getting into the silver tsunami as a problem. Before COVID hit, 300,000 businesses in California were already at risk of closure. And, these businesses could either close their doors, because the next generation is not willing to be the business owner. There aren't that many buyers available for small businesses. And those that do have buyers probably would be gobbled up by larger companies or out-of-state companies. Really, what we want to do is anchor those businesses in their communities, preserve the jobs, and make the jobs better, create a better, more healthy, more enjoyable working environment, share the profits of the business, and empower the workers. And we could do that through conversions, meaning worker buyouts of businesses. Second, we see worker cooperatives as a wealth building tool for people of color. The majority of worker cooperatives in the US are actually owned by people of color. And I should also say majority are women owned as well. So with the COVID pandemic, we've actually gotten 2020 data that says that businesses that are worker owned are more resilient and likely to keep their workers on board, even through something as disturbing as a pandemic. And so our agenda actually for 2020 or 2021, I should say, is a budget request, which we thankfully, I'm very excited to announce, got introduced on the Assembly side already for $36.5 million to do three things. One, get the word out about worker cooperatives and the opportunity for worker ownership transitions to all Californians, meaning small business owners and also workers. So getting the word out has been an essential sort of strategy for us, education and training included. The second item is loan guarantees, because access to finance and getting other finance products for worker-owned cooperatives and also worker ownership transitions can be challenging. And so we want the state to step up, recognizing that it's a win-win-win for the business owner, for the workers, and for the state, because what you're doing when you're transitioning a business that would otherwise be closing its doors to worker ownership, you're basically preventing a lot of people from entering unemployment, having to fall back on a social safety net that, let's be real, has a lot of holes in it. And it's just a cost-saving measure for the state, in addition to all of the social benefits that come from this. And lastly, subsidies for worker ownership transitions, doing feasibility studies to help workers and owners assess if this is a viable strategy for them and to see how they can make it work. And we're really actually encouraging the state to use existing dollars that are already available for this kind of work. So maybe I'll end it there to give enough time for the others, but I would say if you are interested in learning more or even joining the coalition, please do reach out. You can just leave a subject line work and really say CPA follow-up for this conference so that I can know what the context is. But I'm happy to engage more in the Q&A, and I'll end it there. Thank you. Maybe I'll pass it to Trinity.
Thank you so much, Yassi, for a fantastic conversation. I am very excited to get into the conversation, but before we do, we get to hear from my dear friend, Trinity Tran. Trinity is the co-founder of the Public Banking Alliance and Divest LA. And that's the coalition that pushed the city of Los Angeles to divest its finances from Wells Fargo Bank in 2017. She's a founding member, lead organizer, and for most of us, the brainchild of the entire California Public Banking Alliance, which is a statewide coalition of grassroots groups which passed the historic AB 857, which is the Public Banking Act in the California legislature in 2019. She also serves as executive director of Urban Partners Los Angeles, and she initiated the COVID-19 Emergency Food Bank at the start of the pandemic in March of 2020, and now oversees one of the largest food banks in all of Southern California. Trinity, welcome to this conversation.
Great, thank you, David. Thank you, everyone. Let me share my screen 1 second. What are you seeing here? Why is it this way? 1 second. Technical difficulties today. Try this again.
Trinity, I always say that if we can't handle these little things, we can't do the big things like dismantling white supremacy or capitalism. And because I know we can do the big things, I know we can do these little things too.
Well, she's already dismantling capitalism, so.
Okay, I think we're getting there. View, presenter view. Not this one. Slideshow. There we go. Okay, you guys can see my screen. You all can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. We got there. All right. Well, thanks, David. And the California Progressive Alliance. I'm Trinity Tran with the other California Alliance, the California Public Banking Alliance, along with Public Bank Los Angeles. And it's great to be back at this annual convention. And huge thanks to CPA for supporting us in public bank and our work in public banking throughout these past few years. And it's a crucial part of the public banking, the public ownership movement, as this panel is about creating new systems, just and sustainable systems. Public banking really is a crucial part in the creation of a solidarity economy network, and being able to transform the banking system from one that's based on greed and extraction to a publicly owned banking system where money can be used to help our communities and to rebuild and empower communities from the ground up. So in this PowerPoint presentation, I'll explain what a public bank is, why we need public banks, the benefits of public banking. I'll touch on the successes of the Bank of North Dakota, the German Sparkassen network of public banks. I'll do an overview of AB 857, which was the landmark bill we passed in the California state legislature, and why public banking is so important in our economy right now, especially as we're trying to rebuild from the COVID-19 pandemic, and why public banks will play a critical role in this rebuild. And I'll also talk about some pretty exciting developments happening at the local level, at the state level, and then also at the national level. So first slide is, what is a public bank? A public bank is a financial institution that is owned by a public entity, either a state, a city, a region, or a JPA, a Joint Powers Authority. A public bank makes the cost of debt cheaper for the city and state, and it does that by buying and issuing debt below market because it has access to low-cost lending from the Federal Reserve. And there are two important distinctions between public and private banks. One, unlike private commercial banks, the interest and profit of a public bank belongs to the community. So instead of billions of our tax revenues getting siphoned out of state by Wall Street banks, public banks out of state and out of cities by Wall Street banks, public banks allow our states or localities to be able to capture the interest paid to bondholders and recirculate that money back into the local economy. Public banks are also formed with social benefit purposes, which means they're required to invest in and lend to the communities they serve. And this is very central to public banking. The importance of local self-control, where the deposits are made locally, the investments are made locally, the decision-making process for investments are made locally. And that really is the primary benefit of public banks, is to help ensure that our cities are able to keep our money local. And you can imagine if our cities were able to become self-sufficient, they would be able to reinvest public funds back into our communities and redirect public dollars towards addressing things that we actually need, like affordable housing and green energy infrastructure, small business loans, especially in historically underserved areas. And the other important distinction between public and private banks is that, unlike private banks, public banks do not compete with credit unions and community banks. And this is modeled similar to the Bank of North Dakota, which is the only public bank in the United States. And public banks have a partnership relationship with smaller local banks, which means that they work with them to extend their credit lines so that they can offer low-cost consumer benefits. And what we're advocating for within the California Public Banking Alliance is a wholesale bank, or what's called a banker's bank, a bank that would become the main depository for cities and regions, for local governments. We're not competing for customers with community banks and credit unions. This would be a partnership relationship. This is a simple graphic, which I think is essentially public banking in a nutshell. And I think it illustrates a very powerful message that our public funds, the taxes and the fees that our cities and states accrue, now sit in private Wall Street banks. And we can either continue allowing our money to flow towards things like fossil fuels and weapons of war, industries that inflict real harm on our earth and communities, or we can redirect that money towards positive things, building sustainable, regenerative sectors of society, like a green energy economy, affordable housing, in the midst of a housing crisis, and supporting local businesses and focusing on community economic centered and community centered economic development. Why do we need public banks? Public banking it's essentially about creating a just and equitable alternative to Wall Street. So our mission with CPA is to create socially and environmentally responsible public banks that are mandated to serve the people. And cities and counties and states in California and cities across the country hold billions of dollars of our public money in Wall Street banks, and Wall Street banks then charge our local government huge fees to hold these deposits and perform cash management services. And this is money that is being extracted out of our community to essentially line the pockets of private shareholders. And this movement is really about taking the power of money back from private interests and putting it back into the hands of the people where it belongs. And our work, it's important to note that our work with public banking is really rooted in the divestment movement that arose in 2017 in solidarity with Standing Rock and Indigenous allies who were fighting against oil pipelines from being built. And these pipelines were financed by big banks. And it was our divestment movements from with other activists across California, from LA to San Francisco to Santa Rosa to Alameda County. It was our collective work and divestment that then evolved into the public banking movement to divest our city and county dollars from predatory Wall Street banks. Instead of divesting from one big bank and moving funds to another huge behemoth Wall Street bank, public banks would enable our cities and states across the country to divest from Wall Street altogether by creating a bank that would be 100% accountable to the people and to our earth. Another benefit, another reason why we need public banks is to expand access and inclusion. In the United States, 1 out of 4 are either unbanked or underbanked, which means they do not have access to a checking or credit or a credit account. That's 25% of the American population, marginalized communities who have been completely shut out of the banking system, and lack of access to low-cost financial services inflicts real harm to poor people and people of color. And it's difficult to build wealth if you are targeted, if you are preyed upon by banks, by payday lenders with huge fees and interest rates. Another reason why we need public banks is to save money and maximize our tax dollars. Right now, nearly 50% of the cost of all infrastructure project goes towards paying bank interest and fees. And if we were able to fund public projects ourselves through public banks, we could literally half the cost of infrastructure and double our power to invest in our cities. That means more money to build roads, more money to build schools. That's more money funneling back to rebuild our communities, rebuild and strengthen our communities. So we really see public banking as a common sense and logical solutions for cities and states to have financial independence from big banks. This is a breakdown of what LA spends on interest payments to Wall Street. And I think this graphic really hits home and puts the potential of public banking into perspective. I was reading one of Ellen Brown's articles this week and came across Acres Cancel Wall Street report where I pulled these numbers. As an example, LA currently spends over $1 billion paying interest to Wall Street banks. And here's the breakdown showing some of the essential services that our money could instead help fund. That's over 51,000 families. We could, instead of paying over $1 billion, we could help over 51,000 families from being evicted and thrown on the streets. Instead of paying $1 billion, we could help extend $600 a week pandemic unemployment system to over 220,000 people, or provide internet access to every single student in the LA Unified School District. So the city's finances itself by selling bonds to private corporations and buying bonds issued to private corporations. So rather than exporting these public funds for private profit, our demand as the public banking movement is that our cities and our counties and our regions keep public funds public, and public banking is exactly how we do that. Public banking works. The BND, the Bank of North Dakota, is the only public bank in the United States. It was founded over 100 years ago in 1919. It withstood the economic crash of 2008 because it didn't get involved in risky banking practices. It also has a return on investment of 18% and over $7 billion returned to state treasury. And the Bank of North Dakota savings are then passed back to borrowers and communities. And it's more profitable than Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase. Even though its mandate isn't actually to make a profit, but to serve the local communities, to the interests of the local communities. It's a proven model of success. And not only was the BND the only one of the only banks to survive the Great Recession, during COVID-19, during the pandemic, the BND provided more PPP loans to small businesses than any other state. So without the leakages, without the huge fees of Wall Street banks, BND was able to deploy capital fast, efficiently, and help small businesses get back on their feet. There's 2% for loans for infrastructure. Student loans are 2% below federal rates, 1% for businesses, as well as low interest loans for affordable housing, which is critical in California, considering we're dealing with a housing crisis with a statewide shortage of about 3 to 4 million units. Public banks like the BND also have lower operating costs. One of the biggest benefits is that public bankers are public servants, which means no bonuses, no fees, no commissions, no high-paid CEOs, no private shareholders, and no expenditures for advertising. The other example of a successful network of public banking is Sparkassen, which is a network of 400 municipal public banks in Germany, and which were responsible for financing over 70% of their green energy transition. And so the potential to fund not only critical housing developments, but a Green New Deal to be able and help also rebuild marginalized communities makes public banking really a revolutionary and evolutionary and a real transformative policy. AB 857. Many of you may have heard of AB 857. That was the landmark historic bill that we passed at the end of 2019, and that was just a few months before the pandemic hit. And this bill provides a pathway for local governments and joint governments and joint power authorities to form their own banks, and it creates the framework for public banks to be regulated. AB 857, just a little brief overview of what this bill does. It will have the same financial regulatory requirements as commercial banks. So the motivation behind this bill came from our collective vision as grassroots organizers across California. Instead of activists and electeds fighting to create separate local legislation to create their own public banks, it made sense to form an alliance and create a bill that would streamline the process and create a framework for these local public banks to be regulated, with the goal of creating a network of socially and environmentally responsible local public banks. And AB 857 public banks, like credit unions, will be exempt from taxes, and like public agencies, will be exempt from the Brown Act and the Public Records Act, which will ensure that the banks will be run transparently, with good governance, with a real commitment to the public interest. And AB 857 also requires FDIC insurance and collateralization. And what it does is it creates a multi-step process before a public bank license is granted. The first step is the local agency, which means the local government, like Los Angeles, has to create a business plan, a viability study. That business plan has to be voted on and approved by the local governing body, then submitted to the DFPI, then the FDIC. So there are various steps that cities and counties need to take before they can create a public bank. And this bill was created, implemented as a pilot program with no more than 2 licenses to be issued per year, up to a maximum of 10 licenses over a period of 7 years. And the intention is that after a successful pilot program, it would be made permanent so that all communities, the California communities, could benefit. And it's really important to note that's a picture of us citizens lobbying at the state capitol, and this landmark bill came to be because of a coalition of volunteers, of an entire group of volunteers who challenged Wall Street and won by creating a network, a statewide network of citizens lobbyists, and a broad-based coalition that included social justice allies, environmental allies, labor allies, the California Democratic Party Central Committees, national orgs like APWU, or Revolution. And it was really the political capital that we built behind this campaign that helped move public banking further into the realm of respectable public policy, and then became the catalyst for the national public banking movement. COVID-19, why the COVID-19 crisis calls for public banks? The COVID-19 crisis presents a really strong case for why we need public banks now, because over this past year, COVID-19 has really severely impacted our communities, our cities or states across California, and local governments across California. So it's going to be really crucial to problem solve for building back a healthier economy and helping small businesses get back on their feet to be able to create affordable housing, build infrastructure, distribute assistance to people who need it, especially to ensure that underserved communities get the relief that they need. Because looking at the stats nationally, over 40% of Black-owned businesses have closed their doors due to the pandemic. And important part of why public banks can help in rebuilding is because a public bank can do what banks do, which is allow our cities to borrow at bankers' rate and be able to leverage their existing funds up to 10 times for lending. And this is the vehicle that we need to be able to rebuild. And it's long overdue for our cities to have our own banks. Really, now is our moment to create a financial institution that invests in our community, where our public funds can stay local and be leveraged to finance our immediate recovery for the people of California. Next steps for the California Public Banking Alliance. So now that we've legalized public banking in California, the fight pivots back to the city level. So across the state, members of the California Public Banking Alliance we're now working with our local city electeds to create public banks. The East Bay, for instance, is working to fund their business plan in San Diego. 6 out of 9 council members back a public bank business plan in San Francisco. 6 out of 11 supervisors introduced a resolution to create a public bank task force. Here in LA, we just held a high-profile town hall last week with council members Bona and Rahman, Kevin De Leon and Rodriguez, the president of SEIU 721, UFCW Local 770, among housing and environmental allies. And we're now moving to, we're all working to move the process forward to hire a consultant to write the public bank's business plan. So across the state, activists are working with electeds to take the step forward to form AB 857 public banks. And there's also a momentum across the country in New Mexico, Philadelphia, Philly, in New York. And this is going to be announced soon in California. We're working on a public banking option state bill, which will be led by Assemblymember Santiago and SEIU California. It's the AB 1177 bill called the California Public Banking Option Act. And this is going to be an important bill because it's got huge implications for the future of finance. You know, as I mentioned before, 1 in 4 in the U.S. are unbanked or underbanked, and they don't have access to a checking or credit a credit account. That's mostly marginalized communities and people of color who've been shut out of the banking system. So what AB 1177 does is it creates a truly free checking account. It's a way to do simple debit transactions without predatory or extractive banking fees, because poor people, Black and brown folks, and undocumented folks have to turn to payday lenders for basic banking services. So this bill will provide the critically needed access and coverage to marginalized communities, which is a really important step in democratizing finance. So stay tuned for the AB 1177 announcement and campaign rollout. That's going to be happening in the next few weeks. If you've signed on to the CPBA mailing list, we'll be sending out an ally briefing invite, which will be held, I think it's March 18th. So that's CPBA, California Public Banking Alliance, will be sending an update on that campaign. We're also working on a budget bill this year, which requests to allocate money from this year's state budget to help provide grants to CDFIs, to affordable housing loans, technical assistance grants, to cities and counties to help facilitate the formation of these public banks. And that's going to be a hugely critical part in transforming California's economy and creating a blueprint for the rest of the nation. The state legislature also voted to, the state legislature voted to pave the way for a network of public banks. So now really is our moment to manifest, to turn that into reality and create these public banks. So we'll be sending out an organizational sign-on form for both AB 1177 and our budget ask request. And then we also formed the National Public Banking Alliance. So we joined forces with organizers across the nation to work together to amplify the movement at the federal level. We're working with Representatives AOC and Rashida Tlaib on the National Public Banking Act bill that is going to be reintroduced in just a few months in the second quarter. And that's going to essentially make it easier for cities and states across the nation to create public banks in the U.S. So this is a lot of exciting energy and momentum behind public banking, and we're super excited to be working with AOC in the next coming months. And it really now is our moment in history to put our people and our communities first and take our power back from Wall Street banks and reinvest in Main Street, because at the end of the day, it's our money and it's time to take our power back. So join the fight. Go to California Public Banking Alliance.org and sign up to join our mailing list and stay connected on the movement, and get updates on our upcoming campaign, as well as the public banking revolution. So thank you.
And thank you, Trinity Tran. What a fantastic and inspirational presentation. I'm going to cross my fingers and hope to bring Emily Kawano into this conversation. Emily, are you with us? You are not with us, Emily. I'm sorry. One more time.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you. Yes.
Can. Oh.
Yes.
Yay.
Well,
finally, yeah. Sorry about the technological difficulties. Yeah. So I was somewhat distracted just trying to join, but I'm sure David covered all the points and did a great job. So happy to join in the Q&A.
Fantastic. Well, we got some really astute questions, so I'm going to jump right into them. First is from a friend of mine, actually Robert Means, who writes in to say, we're using a taxable nonprofit mutual benefit corporation that offers more flexibility than either tax-exempt nonprofits and government agencies. Any thoughts on this membership corporation that differs only somewhat from the co-op model promoted by Richard Wolff? Any thoughts or comments? And I think, Yassi, you had something to share.
Yeah, and thank you for submitting that. And the link you shared is extremely interesting. I haven't heard of this yet, and it's really exciting. I'm going to share it with my colleagues. But in a nutshell, worker-owned enterprises can essentially take any form. It doesn't really matter. What really matters is the details of your governance and finances. So just briefly looking at what you shared, it seems as though the financial and governance structure is cooperatively aligned, but really a worker cooperative could be, as you say, a nonprofit mutual benefit corporation. It could be a nonprofit public benefit corporation, an LLC, a cooperative corporation. It could even be just a general partnership. So the list goes on, but I would say it's about the details. And so I've asked David actually to share, since I'm in a separate Zoom world than you all are, to share 2 model bylaws for 2 cooperatives that the Sustainable Economies Law Center has incubated. The first is East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, and the other is People Power Solar Cooperative. Their bylaws are incredible. They are actually cartoon bylaws, and they're shared publicly, and we encourage folks to copy them, use them, adjust it to their own needs. But it's pretty revolutionary to have a cartoon-based bylaws so that the members of your cooperative can actually even understand what it is that they are a part of, and also shape it themselves. But we have in those cooperatives, similar to what I think I've seen in your co-op, anchor members, community members, actual subscriber members for the solar cooperative. And it's an extremely adaptive model. And also it takes into consideration not only the workers, because workers are a class of member in those cooperatives, but also the stakeholders, the consumers, and the community members who are affected by the cooperative also have a say, which is really a way to enshrine in your bylaws environmental protections, community protections, and involvement and participation of the broader community. So I would say definitely take a look at those bylaws. It almost seems as though folks in your group may have seen them already, just from looking at your bylaws. But absolutely, that's a model that you could use. And really, it's about the details.
And thank you so much, Yassi. And I completely agree with everything Yassi just said. And I want to lift up because I had not heard of Loopworks either, but the fact that they're talking about personal rapid transit, is incredibly exciting to me, because there's only a handful of places anywhere in the world who are using this, to me, very common sense solution. And the fact that y'all are moving forward on this using cooperative principles, and that's the thing that I want to lift up from Yassi, and that is that cooperative principles can take any number of different forms. The question is, are you actually democratically making and implementing decisions? Are you actually empowering people? And then who owns the thing, right? So I'm really excited to learn more about Loopworks. And again, like, I did not know about it from before, but I'm really grateful that you added it. Margaret writes in to ask, if someone would like to form a worker-owned cooperative, but doesn't have a lot of money for legal help, what resources can they turn to other than to try to find relevant NOLO press publications? And Yassi, kind of feels like I'm going to be tapping you for this one.
I'm loving all the co-op questions. Keep them coming. So that's a great question. And of course, if we're saying worker cooperatives are a solution for underpaid workers and folks who are typically from historically marginalized communities, how can we expect these communities to also pay attorneys? The upside is that a lot of co-op attorneys are activists and are willing to provide sliding scale fees for cooperatives. And so that's just a general statement. But of course, that's not true for all co-op attorneys. I would say for the Sustainable Economies Law Center, almost every week we provide by donation legal advice. So if you have a question and you need an answer, I would say you're right. First step would be check out legal guides, try and do as much homework as you can before you come in to get legal services, because a lot of the time attorneys tell you stuff that you could have figured out yourself. So you want to do all your homework in advance if you can, and then come to the table with a lot of specific questions and get the answers that you need. But you're always welcome to come by the Legal Cafe. Now it's all on Zoom, so anyone in California can come by for free or by donation legal advice. I've asked David to share a link to the Legal Cafe. And also, it's not just legal advice. You also oftentimes will need some accounting advice because cooperative finance is complex, and tax advice is a special area of focus. So I've also shared a document that shows, co-op attorneys and co-op accountants, because again, it's a special skill. And I would say that's a good place to start for ongoing support and advice. And another word on this, we're very aware that 1, access to finance, 2, access to information about cooperatives, and 3, access to technical assistance is a major barrier for co-ops if we're talking about really getting these going in communities, in our focus communities. And so to address that, actually, I'm really proud to say that the city of Berkeley, due to our advocacy, actually has subsidized legal services for anyone who wants to start a cooperative or convert their business to a cooperative in the city. So if you happen to be in Berkeley, that's an opportunity for you. Otherwise, keep your eyes peeled. We're working hard at the Worker-Owned Recovery California Coalition to really push the state to create special services for cooperatives. Already, it's set aside $1 million to support immigrant-owned cooperatives, which is, I think, unprecedented. So we're really excited to see that stuff going on, and hopefully more exciting things to announce the next time we meet.
Thank you, Yassi, and thank you all for these great questions. Please keep them coming, and any comments that you want to make. I'm turning now to Timothy, who writes, in committing to pluralism, how to transform our system to be democratic socialism more than just social democratic. I see inherent characteristics in the US and in the EU where democracy is fully controlled by capital. Emily, I'm wondering if I can turn to you, because I know that you and Julie wrote a really powerful essay in the Nonprofit Quarterly, which we'll make sure to drop into the public chat so that folks can follow that as well. But I'm wondering if I can tap you for that question, Emily.
Oh, yay. I can pull up a slide and hope that the sound doesn't completely go. So let me try. Okay. So is that showing up, and can you still hear me?
Yes to both.
Okay, great. Okay. So that's a definition of capitalism. And this is a little table that there's this article, yes, that I co-authored with Julie Mathai, who is also an economist, just trying to achieve or work towards greater clarity about capitalism and post-capitalism. And so you can see under capitalism, we would completely agree with that person in saying that here are three broad models or paradigms of capitalism. So neoliberalism is what we have now, right? Pretty cutthroat capitalism, market good, state bad, right? Trying to shrink the state down as much as possible. But before neoliberalism, we had New Deal capitalism, which was, post World War II, where the role of the government was more legitimized, where there was a stronger social welfare state, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, more regulations, more acceptance of the public sector, and then social democracy, which you mentioned, which think Scandinavia and many other European countries. So social democracy is sort of like New Deal capitalism on steroids. So we would certainly agree that, there's some debate about this, but we would certainly agree that the Scandinavian countries, although they're much more, much stronger sort of New Deal foundation than in the United States, they're still dominated by private capitalist corporations. So we think it is important. It is very important to understand what is capitalism and not see. I think that there is really a difference between social democracy and not necessarily seeing that as the answer. There is another possibility beyond social democracy, which is really to go for some kind of post-capitalist transformation. So I'll just point out solidarity economy. And, when I was trying to get on the call, I'm not sure what David was saying, was covering, because I was just dealing with my own technology. So I don't know if you covered this, but just super quick, solidarity economy would clearly not include authoritarian state socialism, those kind of models, right, that are authoritarian. But we would embrace both democratic forms of socialism as well as various other isms that might not even have a name. Yeah, so good question. Fits nicely with this slide. I'm so happy I got to share at least one slide. So thanks.
And we're so happy to have you back with us, Emily. So I'm going to now turn to a question very specifically to you, Trinity, and that is, we have AB 857, why no public banks yet?
Unmuting myself. So institutional progress takes time. I touched on it in the slideshow, but what AB 857 did is create a process for cities and counties and regions to be able to apply for a public bank. So the reality is the Department of Business.
Oh, Trinity, you muted yourself, I think.
You did.
Am I unmuted now?
You are.
Okay, so the current status is that the department, it was formerly called the Department of Business Oversight, and now called DPFI, Department of Protections and Financial Protections Innovation. They are currently drafting the regulations for public banks. So they already have done two iterations of comments. There's about to be a third and I believe final round of rulemaking. regulatory rulemaking. So we are expecting that those regulations are going to be finalized by the end of the year. So cities like Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, in California right now are working with their local governments, with their elected officials to create the public bank business plan, to hire consultants here in Los Angeles. That motion is pending. It's right now sitting in the Economic and Jobs Development Committee. So our next step is to work with the Chief Legislative Analyst's offices to draft the scope of work so that the city can hire a consultant to move forward with writing a public bank's business plan. And that then has to be approved by city council, the local governing body, and then submitted to the DFPI for approval, and then to the FDIC for approval. So it will likely not be, it will likely take another few years. We'll obviously, as activists and advocates, we will push for this to move as quickly as possible. But we are still waiting for the regulations to be drafted while we're working with our city councils to proceed with creating a business plan for the public bank.
Perfectly answered, Trinity. And as a lawyer myself and as an advocate, let me just point out there are rules and regulations. And then there are rules and regulations. And I don't mean to be coy, because think about it. You can write rules and regulations that basically make it impossible to do something, or you can make rules and regulations that make it super easy to do something. And to be honest, as advocates, we went to the department, then the Department of Business Organization, now the DFPI, and we said, the state said that they wanted to see public bankings. You should make it very easy to create public banks for all the reasons that Trinity just laid out. They're so good. You should facilitate this easier. Guess what? Wall Street lobbied and said, oh no, this is public money. You should make it very, very hard to create public banks because it's public money. Oh, and to their credit, the rules that are being promulgated, we are in that conversation. And Trinity, my read of that is they are playing it straight down the middle. They're not making it any more difficult to create a public bank than private banks, but they're not making it any easier to create a public bank than a private bank. That's how I'm experiencing it. How do you see it?
Well, I think that's where the political pressure and the movement building comes in. We're working with SEIU California and as Assemblymember Santiago, and we're about to introduce the California Public Banking Option Bill, and as well as as I mentioned in the presentation, our work with AOC and Tlaib's office on introducing the National Public Banking Act. So once you have all of this political momentum building, I think it would be difficult for these offices not to move forward. And because part of what we're doing with movement building is legitimizing the ideas, making politically safe. Having Governor Newsom sign the AB 857, the Public Banking Act, was a huge step forward in moving this what could have been seen as a very far left idea into a politically safe space. And that's why we had worked with labor and Democratic clubs and central committees in the party across the state to help move that into move that policy into a politically viable space. And so I think we're going to, with the work that we're continuing to do and the momentum that's continuing to build, it would be difficult for the regulatory agents, the DFPI, even the FDIC, to not take public banking seriously. And so we're very hopeful and optimistic about the future of public banking, especially with the momentum that's building across the country. It really is the evolution of a financial system that's only served a very small handful of people, and we really see it. It's an idea whose time has come. This is a few years ago. This is a virtually unknown idea. When we led the Measure B campaign in Los Angeles, we were the first city in the nation to do a ballot measure vote, asking voters to approve the next steps for Los Angeles to amend one section of the city charter to move forward with a public bank. No one knew about public banking, but yet still, even with a tenth of the budget, even with just 4 months to organize, we got 430,000 people to vote yes on a relatively new and revolutionary and bold idea. and the more you explain public banking, the more the movement builds, the more that we do outreach, the more that it becomes a really logical and sensible step towards the future. So we do understand that that with institutional process and progress and development takes time, especially developing a system that is an alternative to Wall Street. I think it's important to note that instrumental to creating change is rather than fighting an old, outdated system, it's about focusing your energy to create and organize and strategize to build a new system and render the old completely obsolete. So we believe deeply in the transformative change that we're that fuels our work as volunteer activists in the California Public Banking Alliance and in the public banking movement across the state. So we're very optimistic about the future.
So I know that there was an invitation for us to also ask each other questions. So Yassi, I had a question for you about the conversion work. So one of the things, so I do a lot of solidarity economy work, but my day job is I'm a co-op developer in Springfield, Mass. We work in underserved communities, and conversions are certainly, we've worked with a number of businesses that have been interested. They haven't, only one has really moved ahead. But I'm very aware of the need for ongoing training, right? Like a really important shift is that building that worker co-op owner culture, right? Like being invested as an owner instead of just clocking in 9 to 5 as a worker. And so is that integrated into the funding and the infrastructure? Are there folks that can work in all these communities? It sounds like statewide to do that, because it can take a couple years to create that culture shift.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, that's great to know that you're doing that work out there. I didn't realize that. I think the situation in California is different, and also in the Bay Area is different. We benefit from, excuse me, a pretty robust ecosystem of cooperative developers, business consultants, legal support, financial advisors who can really dig into all of this, including also the culture and leadership development and the longer term handholding that a cooperative conversion should go through. With a conversion, like you mentioned, Emily, most people in our society never have the opportunity to make a choice for themselves. It's sort of the hand you're dealt is the hand you're dealt, and you go and you take orders from someone else. To have that fundamental shift from being someone's employee to being your own boss is both empowering and also a challenge. And I've heard from, one conversation I had with a business owner who decided to transition her landscaping business to worker ownership. So she remained on as a worker, as a part of this with her other colleagues, and really talked to me about how, one of the unspoken requirements for a successful cooperative is a shift in your perspective and stepping up, right? Because you're invested in it. That said, the data really shows us that workers are more productive in a worker-owned workplace. They are more invested, and there's far less turnover, particularly in healthcare and home care industries when it is worker-owned. So there's both a higher challenge to being a part of a worker cooperative, but an equal, if not greater, satisfaction that comes with being a part of a worker cooperative. So I think a lot of people rise to the occasion, but absolutely recognizing that there is a need for that technical support. And like you said, for a longer term than just, maybe the first year during the transition and then hands off. I think a lot of cooperative developers are realizing that and are providing more wraparound services, actually. But the key is really a robust cooperative ecosystem. So, that's really like David mentioned at the top. I'm involved with the network of Bay Area cooperatives, and luckily the Bay Area is full of cooperative developers and people who are making sure that all of those missing pieces are put together.
And I'll say, and part of that ecosystem is a Slice of New York worker-owned co-op pizza. And I want to lift that one up because that's a conversion that was a successful conversion. They have been instrumental in the work that the work is doing statewide, and are about to become the next hotbed of really fusing public policy and public dollars, investing in the ability to actually help government not prevent or thwart cooperative development, but actually to facilitate it. I'll also just share that at Cooperation Humboldt, we're now incubating, well, not yet a dozen, 11 potential worker co-ops, because what we did was offer a 1 hour introduction to the concept of cooperatives. Then we did what was known we called it the Worker Owner Academy, which was really just 4 90-minute sessions that required either $15 or completely free, but you had to put skin in the game by actually completing I can't afford $15, but I will answer the following set of questions, right? So in other words, to give somebody an investment of either their time or just a couple of dollars to say that they wanted it. Out of that, and about 150 people so far, and these are ongoing things, we now have 11 potential worker-owned cooperatives that are being incubated with technical assistance. And what we found, Yassi, is that we've partnered with our local small business development corporation. So we are literally paid consultants at Cooperation Humboldt for accounting help, for legal help, and so forth. But the thing that people most need help with, how do you make and implement decisions democratically? Because as Trinity and you, I think all of us have said, we don't have the culture of power with. We have not actually had many genuinely little d democratic experiences. So what we're finding is helping people to get some practice on that and living into the co-op principles has been incredibly important. I want to lift up Justin, who has written in with a question for the panel. Do you think that a public banking system can work at the national level, or is it more fit for state and local governments? So obviously we're going to start with you, Trinity, but I'm going to ask the other two panelists to weigh in on that question as well.
We're focused on creating local public banks because they can be more responsive to the needs of local communities. And so, even within the California Public Banking Alliance, we wanted to focus first not on creating a state public bank, but we're creating local public banks, city, county, regional public banks. And we actually strategically created our legislation, drafted the legislation so that it could be broad enough to even apply to urban areas as well as rural areas, knowing that that needs are different, lending needs and priorities are different between different geographic areas of California. So it's important as far as when it comes to local control, which is a huge part of the public banking, the California Public Banking Alliance, and the philosophy behind public banks. Local control is very important. So it's critical to have a local public banking system that could serve the direct needs of the communities on a much smaller level, and which would potentially work with a state public bank that could service, larger infrastructure, larger swaths of California's and larger infrastructure project. But that's all part of the public banking ecosystem that we envision can be built for the future. But for us, it's a local first approach to creating change and building power from the ground up.
I'll add to that and say that we already have a national public-private bank. It's called the Federal Reserve, but it is not very democratic. And so there are proposals out there to democratize the Fed, right? It's really a banker's bank, and it's pretty much run by bankers with that perspective. And, you know, they're not elected, they're appointed, and there's not a lot of accountability. So anyway, there are proposals to try to democratize the Fed. So yeah, I think there's certainly room for thinking about that and pursuing that option.
Yassi, do you have any thoughts there?
No, that actually was fascinating. Thank you, Emily, for that. I'm going to be thinking about that for a while. No, I don't have anything else to add. Thank you.
So, well, the next question really, I think, probably is to you, because Karen writes in to ask, can a homeowners association be a worker cooperative or a retirement community? Can it be run as a corporation and then be converted?
Well, that's a great question. I guess I don't, you should come to our legal cafe. And again, if David, you could share that in that group's chat, that would be amazing. But I think this sort of relates to the first question we had, which is cooperative decision-making can take a lot of different forms. And I mean, HOAs have their own set of requirements, and I don't work with HOAs and I'm not familiar with that. So I would say that's a juicy question to dive into. But having them be more democratically run, having them be more collaborative, certainly sounds like a compatible thing. And this sort of goes back to what Emily was saying about governance, right? And taking ownership and leadership and sharing decision-making power. It's a skill set that can be developed and it can be honed in by practice. So maybe Emily, actually, if you have thoughts to add to this, I would be interested to hear.
I mean, there's tons and tons and tons of housing co-ops, and it sounds more like that's what that person is talking about. Like, it's democratically run housing association, tons of experience with housing co-op. It wouldn't be a worker co-op because you don't have workers, right? You're not making something, you're consuming something collectively. So tons of experience with that, yeah.
And thank you for that answer, Emily, because it gives me the opportunity to just remind all of us that, you know, the solidarity economy movement is not just about worker co-ops or just about public banking. It is actually about that framework that I tried to sort of pinch hit for Emily when she was having the technical difficulties. But again, we're democratizing the economy, democratizing our culture. And it gives me a chance, Emily, to ask you to just say a word or two about community land trusts, participatory budgeting, some of the other tools that we didn't get a chance to go into because there are so many very concrete policies that can democratize our country. Oh, Emily, you muted yourself.
So can you see this slide?
Yes.
Okay, so these are just some examples. It's broken down in these sectors. As an economist, these are the sectors I think about, economic sectors. So we have production, distribution, exchange, consumption, finance, and governance. And so you can see these in the bullet points examples of all of these solidarity economy practices. You can see that there's this huge foundation upon which to build. We're not starting from scratch. I'd like to point out that some of these practices are very old, like cooperatives are old, food co-ops are old. Many of these things are very old. Some things are kind of newer, like participatory budgeting, maybe it's a little bit of a newer thing. Anyway, some are old, some are new, some are mainstream. Like, look under governance, right? See the fourth bullet point down is public sector, right? Some things that we have probably are keepers, right? In this other world, right? Public schools, public parks, various kinds of social programs, regulations, etc. So some things are mainstream, and some things are quote unquote alternative. So solidarity economy is very diverse. It exists in all sectors. There's a huge foundation to build on, and the trick really is to try to take all these currently siloed and separated practices that just sort of isolated. They seem kind of cute, but not that powerful. And connect them up so that we're all pulling in the same direction to create a different post-capitalist economy. And then, as David mentioned, the broad meaning of economy, which is really management of our household. You can think of that as management of our communities, our regions, our country, and the world. So this is just a few, right? This is not exhaustive, but it gives you some example of the kind of things that solidarity economy, or rather that are aligned with solidarity economy values.
Thank you, Emily. What a fantastic and rich conversation we've had. We're coming to the end of our time together, so I'm going to give our panelists an opportunity for closing thoughts, and we'll go Trinity, Yassi, and Emily. So Trinity,
take it away. All right.
take it away.
Thanks, David. So just to ground the conversation, I know we started with bigger picture, what is a solidarity economy, and then moving into public banking, and what AB 857, the Public Banking Act and the public banking movement is about is implementing a real world solution. This is a specific solution to fundamentally transform finance. And I think part of the story is how important activists and organizing was in manifesting this idea, this what could have been a very abstract revolutionary idea, manifesting that idea into a movement, into a political win, and grassroots. Our grassroots campaign, the California Public Banking Alliance campaign, at the end of the day, we challenged the most powerful corporate lobbying force in the world, and we won. And we did that without lobbyists. We did that without money, without any funding. And we were told the bill would die in committee, that we were told this would be a 2-year bill or longer. We were up against such an uphill battle, but we fought this, because taking the power out of the private mega banks and putting it in the hands of people is that crucial and necessary step towards economic justice, towards building a solidarity economy. And at the end of the day, we won by out-organizing the banks. So, that's an important part of the discussion as we're talking about policy is understanding and being able to organize from the grassroots, from the bottom up. At the end of the day, victory isn't about how much money you have. It's about how resourceful you are. It's about how strategic you are in your approach, and it's being able to mobilize people into a political force. And I think most importantly, victory is about how hard you're willing to fight to win. So with that, the future, I want to leave off by saying that the future of our people on our planet really depends on our ability to problem solve, and public, at the end of the day, all of the ills of society are so infinitely tied to our financial system. And we now have an incredible opportunity to redefine finance, redirect how money flows into our society, and really build a system for the greater good. And so now really is our time to unleash the potential for this large scale structural change. And I hope that our story with the California Public Banking Alliance and what we did as grassroots organizers really helped inspire others. And I do want to note that David Cobb is an organizer with the California Public Banking Alliance. Not only that, he's actually our onboarding representative for the California Public Banking Alliance. So if you are an organizer in California, and you are interested in getting involved in the movement, reach out to us at calpba@gmail.com, or you can actually reach out to David directly. I think he might even drop his email in the chat, because he's our initial point of contact for the Alliance. And so please reach out. This is our moment to fight. We're really excited at the potential and the possibilities and the momentum building across the nation. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Trinity, and you made me blush. I can look at myself on the camera. So thanks for those kind words. And I will say, as far as I'll just drop my email into the chat so that folks, if you're interested in getting onboarded onto the California Public Banking Alliance, and to Emily and to Trinity, and well, to all of you, the three of you, there have been multiple requests for your slides. So if y'all will send them to me, I will ensure if folks want those slides, I will get them to you. Yassi.
Sure. I guess for closing thoughts, I'd say another world is possible. And I really think that we can solve for our current challenges as well as historic oppression and sort of atone for that as a nation through this other world that we're trying to co-create. And I think, as Emily shared, many of these elements have already existed before. They're not new. Some of them are newer. And in fact, many of them exist right now, both here and abroad to various different extents. And really, I think the power now is in connecting them. And Emily and David and I have been talking a lot about that recently, but really connecting these various projects so that we see them as a coherent whole, as a coherent push towards some broader, what we're calling movement of movements, or whatever you want to call it, that we are all on the same side to see each other as colleagues, as co-conspirators, as allies, and doing the work together and all participating towards building this better world. And I just also want to put a plug for those who are considering cooperatives as a way to build resiliency and empowerment, that this country has a rich history of cooperatives. And in fact, much of it began with our African American communities, former slaves, trying to basically reaching for cooperativism as, by necessity, as a means for self-reliance, to get by and to build power. And I think we can really learn from that. And Jessica Gordon-Nemhart does an incredible job as an author bringing together that rich history of cooperative economics in the Black community. I just want to say there are misconceptions about cooperatives being hippy-dippy co-op food. That's not the full picture. And I think the power lies in understanding the history and also understanding the dismantling of that history. So again, thank you for having us, and I'll pass it to Emily.
Yeah, final thoughts. So maybe building on what's been said just now, U.S. Solidarity Economy Network has also been moving forward this broad way of thinking about resist and build. So to the extent that build, right, the build is actually building the solidarity economy practices, this whole huge foundation of practices to build and strengthen. It's also really important to be well connected up with the resist side of things as well. So the grassroots social movements and the on-the-ground community organizing. And then the other sector, the third circle, is kind of the electoral political strategy. And all those three spheres need to work together. The solidarity economy without the social movement it can easily turn very inward and be thinking about how does this co-op survive and lose its roots. And we've seen that over and over, to some extent in the cooperative movement, but certainly in, like, credit unions are a good example, or the electric co-op, right? So trying to keep that connection with social movement and organizing and solidarity economy is really important. And then just to be thinking about elected officials and policy making and how important that is. The last thing I'll say is that we added a fourth circle to those three, which is right in the center. We put culture, art, interpersonal and personal transformation, because that's just so core, right? Thinking about ourselves and how we relate to each other, and how culture and the arts really have this huge, almost invisible role in shaping who we are and how we behave and how we interact with each other. So it's a nice multi-faceted way of thinking, like, of all the connections we need to build, not only between all the solidarity economy practices, but also social movements and folks that are in the struggle of electoral politics. And then that whole thing of, yeah, I mean, maybe it's spirituality or care or anyway, all that stuff. So I'll stop there.
Oh,
Thank you so much.
Emily, thank you, and Trinity and Yassi. And I also want to thank Nick Cortez and the entire California Progressive Alliance for giving us the opportunity to have this conversation with you. And Emily, I am especially appreciative of you bringing us back into the realm of electoral politics, because we are, in fact, at the annual convention of the California Progressive Alliance. And I just want to give a plug for why I'm an active member of the California Progressive Alliance, because I am an unapologetic Green Party member, and I work with progressive Democrats, socialists, and independents all the time. And do you know why I do that? Because I want to win. I don't want to just critique the system. I want to win a new world. And I know that winning that new world means that we have to engage in practices, regardless of who's in office, to dismantle white supremacy and heteropatriarchy and settler colonialism and capitalism. We have to do the things that meet people's needs. And we have to engage in electoral politics in an authentic way, in a transformational way. And we need to engage in art and culture. I often say one of the ways that you know you actually have a movement, as opposed to just like people trying to do things, is when the principles and values of the movement begin to reflect in poetry and sculpture, in music, in visual paintings. I mean, like, that's how you actually know you have a movement, is when the movement begins to express itself across the mediums. So Emily, your point again was really beautifully made. And then the very last thing that I want to say to each and every one of you who are watching, like, get in where you fit in. Like, whatever it is that actually speaks to your heart, like, that's what you should be doing. But do it in a way that is part of a liberatory framework, that is actually understanding that this new world that Yassi talked about, it's not just possible, it's actually beginning. And our job is to nurture that. Our job is to help transition not into a completely new world, but to remember the world that we all, our ancestors, lived in before. Because as my mentor, Chris Peters of the 7th Generation Fund for Indigenous Development often reminds me, David, everybody descends from indigenous people. You do too. There was a time when my ancestors knew what it was like to live in right relation with Mother Earth and all living creatures. And that's what we need to collectively get back to. Thanks again for coming. Peace.